Hey, folks. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us around the world. My name is Tyler Benster, and I'm very delighted to be hosting this AMA with John Wiegley, the Chief Technology Officer of Kadena. So this is really, really exciting. John's an absolutely phenomenal talent and an interesting person, as I know we'll get to hear over the next 40 minutes or so. And I'm really, really excited to get to know John too. This will be my introduction to John as well, and I'm really, really looking forward to meeting him and hearing more about his impressive background, past and present, and future ambitions with Kadena. By way of brief background, I work with Kadena Eco, the accelerator and hypergrowth arm of Kadena, where we help facilitate and accelerate builders that are building on top of what we conceive is the best layer one out there, Kadena and Chainweb. Kadena Eco, of course, runs a grants program that many of us are familiar with, and I've seen some of the grant cohorts. If it's new to you and you are a builder or considering building on Kadena, please do get in touch. Take a look at the grants program, learn about some of the ways that we can help builders that are going to be creating the next generation of fantastic Web3 projects and beyond. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up John onto the stage. Hello, John.
Hello. Hi, Tyler.
Great to see you. Really such an honor to have you here, and I hope you're getting settled in as CTO.
Yes, it's taking a little bit of time, but slowly and surely.
So for those that aren't familiar with you, would you mind starting off by just giving us a brief background and context for how you found yourself here today?
Well, I've been moving in this direction from just regular software engineering, mostly C++ compilers, actually, for a really long time, debuggers, linkers, that sort of really low-level type of thing. And I got then interested in functional programming about 10 years ago. And I've been sort of rebuilding my career around functional programming because I just loved it and enjoyed it so much. And as I was doing that, the blockchain explosion happened, and it kind of created a cottage industry at the moment for functional programmers and people interested in correctness. And I didn't come to this from a crypto background. I wasn't a big owner or trader in Bitcoin or any of the early blockchain projects, but a lot of my friends from the Haskell community were moving to these companies. So I knew Doug Beardsley, the director of engineering at Kadena. I'd known him for many, many years. He'd been to my house. We were friends for a long time. And I had met Stuart Popejoy, the CEO at Kadena, before. And when I was at a point where I was able to now start looking for a new position, I reached out to both of them and I said, hey, what are you up to? What are you doing? And when they told me about the Pact language and their hopes for the Pact language as a foundation for secure smart contracts, it really fit my own interests and the things I want to do more.
Fantastic. So functional programming is definitely a topic I'm personally very excited to get into a little bit more with you. And it's really interesting to hear that observation of how the functional programming community has started to be kind of one of these early groups that has embraced blockchain from a just procedure perspective. And I mean, I think there's this ancient joke in the Haskell community about it being this beautiful, pure language, as long as you don't need to do any side effects and you don't need to touch the real world. And one of the interesting things about blockchain is that there's some similar challenges, at least initially, where if you look at Bitcoin or Ethereum, that right off the bat, even though they had some degree of scripting capabilities, that the ability for blockchain to interface with anything outside of the blockchain was very, very limited. And so it sort of had this, at least from an aesthetic perspective, this kind of interesting overlap with functional programming communities that had really figured out how to do correctness properly in these pure regimes, and then starting to figure out how do you actually influence the world from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to hear a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit more about some of your background. I know you've played a huge role in all sorts of communities, from the C++ committees to doing work in functional programming and the Haskell communities. I wonder if you could just highlight maybe 2 or 3 of kind of your past roles and experiences that have prepared you to be CTO of Kadena.
Well, so one of the longest projects I've been a part of since really when I first started programming was the Emacs community. And I've been writing Emacs list packages for many decades now. I think I started using Emacs something like 28 years ago, and I've been a very, very active user of it ever since. And at one point, I became the Emacs maintainer for a couple of years. So working with communities of people who have similar interests, but trying to get this really complex and difficult piece of software out the door, reliable, correct, doing what people expect. I feel like that prepared me more for this sort of CTO role than a lot of other things that I had done, which were more problem focused on one specific area. But being CTO requires taking a vision and translating that vision into some sort of action plan with other engineers and getting that out the door together. And I feel like Emacs was a large part of that, preparing me for that. And then another community is the community.
And John, just very briefly, for those on the call that aren't programmers and aren't familiar with Emacs, could you just give a brief description of what that is?
Oh, that's a very good point. Thank you for reminding me of that. Emacs is a text editor that has been around since the late 1960s. It's one of the oldest and longest living open source projects out there.
Fantastic. Yeah. And so if you've ever seen someone that looks like they're really hacking away at a computer and there's screens that are whizzing by and there's a million symbols everywhere and it looks like someone has a productivity of 10 people, they might be programming in Emacs.
It's possible.
That's great. I didn't mean to cut off your narrative. You're about to
say
something.
Oh, no, not at all. I was going to say one of the other experiences that I've had in the last few years, last couple of decades, was also a community that's built up around the plain text accounting movement. So I created this piece of software around 2003 called Ledger, and allows you to do double entry bookkeeping on your machine, but using a text input format. So it's kind of built around the idea, again, of a compiler, where the data for your financial transactions is the input and the reports you want to produce from it are the output. And several other people have taken this idea and run with it on other platforms, but it was nice to see a community evolve around this and how we all work together to sort of support one another and get the idea moving forward beyond just the one implementation I made in C++. I think that was also eye-opening for me in how engineers can collaborate and work together.
Super interesting. So there's obviously these similarities with the ledger being this sort of foundational data model that we think about in blockchain and in that project, with the key innovation of blockchain being the distribution of the ledger rather, and the censorship resistance and how you do consensus around, who can write what and when you can write what. So I think that's a really interesting parallel. And of course, Emacs has this interesting parallel too, where Emacs is written as a Lisp and Pact is a Lisp as well. And so there's sort of these more than just semantic similarities, I think, between some of these past experiences that you're bringing to the table.
That's very true. There are a lot of things that rhyme with my past.
That's very, very cool. And no doubt part of that is due to your own aesthetic as a programmer and as a technologist in terms of enjoying certain approaches for doing things. I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts as to where functional programming and blockchain intersect. For those that aren't as familiar with functional programming, maybe if you could just give a very brief primer, and then I'd love to hear how you see that as beneficial to blockchain.
Sure. So let me define then what I mean by functional programming, because it is a term that can be used and applied to many different things. It can be applied to idioms within languages that are not very functional themselves. But when I use the term functional to describe a programming style, it means that the outputs of any function are dependent upon its inputs. And that's really the essence of what functional programming is all about. And then a functional programming language takes these types of functions and makes it very easy to compose them together. And you find that even in very popular languages today, for example, Rust, just taking two independent functions and fusing them together to make a third function is not quite as easy as it is in a language where this is a primitive and first-class operation like it is in Haskell.
So this is this idea of composability, that you have a piece of code here, you have a piece of code there that two different people wrote. And wouldn't it be nice if you could have, project A or function A and project B or function B sort of be able to be joined together in a way where someone doesn't have to redo the work that maybe someone else has already done?
Exactly. A lot of languages have this kind of abstraction, and they usually call it modules or modularity, Whereas in a functional language, it's much more low level. It's the language that you speak as you're writing the code to build up your program. And then a blockchain, if we see it as an indelible public ledger, so this is just a ledger that's accounting for things that are happening on the chain from transaction, block to block, transaction to transaction. It's very easy to see the blockchain as an input, which is the contract or the transaction that someone submitted to the chain, and the output, which is what appears on chain as a result of executing that block and changing the state. So it's a very natural fit to the functional way of thinking, the manner that a blockchain operates.
Very, very cool. On a slightly different note, I want to make sure that we have some community in this discussion. So for everyone that's out there, going to do some shout outs, and please, we feel free to comment or post in on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, wherever you may be. We absolutely love that this is an introduction, both for community to John, as well as for John to community. And I think that some of the excitement around folks interacting is always something that is so vibrant about the Kadena ecosystem and the Kadena army. Knowing that this is a project where when you work on something and you push code and you deploy a smart contract, that there's a whole Kadena army of folks that are out there eager to try out the latest, to see what folks are building, and to help promote and help accelerate adoption of new ideas and technology. So as I kind of cycle through some of these shout outs and comments, I want to keep the discussion going. I'd love to hear, you talked a little bit about how you had met Doug and Stuart through the functional programming communities. I'd be very curious to hear a bit more about how you came to this journey of joining Kadena, and what kind of put you over the edge in terms of deciding to come on board.
So I used to work at a company, so maybe 5-6 years ago, where I was doing government contracting and working on proofs for the correctness of software systems, usually critical systems that were part of military programs where correctness was an absolute necessity. And I moved from that company to work for another blockchain project called Dfinity. And this was really my introduction to crypto and to blockchain in general. And as I was working there, it became really critical, very significant to me, that the correctness of the contracts you write on the chain are just as essential as the contract of the chain itself. And even at Dfinity, I did start doing proof work towards establishing a formal foundation for understanding the semantics and meaning of the chain that was there. But when I talked to Stuart and Doug, I found that Stuart really, in his creation of the Pact language, has made this concern a really first-class citizen. He's all about correctness and making a language for building smart contracts that gets rid of the foot guns, that moves out of the way all of the things that you can do that make correct contracts hard to write. So when he presented to me many of the limitations that are in the Pact language, like the absence of recursion, the absence of a lot of iteration constructs, the absence of mutable variables, I saw those as actually liberation, because they remove from you the need to concern yourself with some of the classic causes of bugs.
Right. When you think about different programming environments and languages, you think about perhaps someone taking an introductory Python class, and maybe the first time they deal with a while loop, they inevitably shoot themselves in the foot and write a function that spins their computer CPU and does nothing and just is permanently stuck. Versus you take someone to an Excel spreadsheet, and even a first-time user can be quite proficient in you show them a couple tricks about how to reference other cells or add together primitive things, and people tend to be quite proficient in writing something in Excel that is then a usable spreadsheet. And while it is possible for an expert in Excel to crash it, it's pretty rare for the day-to-day user to come up with something that manages to bork the system. And so there's that interesting notion of saying, how do you provide enough tools for someone to do the task at hand, without providing them the tools that provide a lot of power, but are likely to let people shoot themselves in the foot, which is particularly egregious in cases where you aren't just monitoring or doing accounting of cash that's already flowed, but in some cases moving a currency that holds tremendous value.
Right. Yeah, and I see a question in the comments, which is, do they think that basing Pact on Haskell is a handicap because other blockchains have gone with Go or Rust? And this is a very good question, actually. And I think this gets to the heart of some of the matter here. When we do engineering work, there are always two sides to the problem that we're solving: what we're doing and how we're doing it. So if I say what I'm doing is sorting a list, that's the end of the conversation. You don't need to know more than that. But how am I sorting the list? Well, now there's bubble sort, insertion sort, heap sort, quick sort. There are many, many different ways I can do it. And those have computational impact, how long it takes to run, how much memory it uses, but the what remains the same. And I think Haskell is a very, very good language if your focus is on the what. It is, in some cases, it does create difficulty if your focus is on the how. So if you really, really need to know how is memory going to be allocated and distributed among a multiprocessor computer group, what are the dynamics of the heap going to be, then a language like Rust is a little bit more natural. Whereas in Haskell, it requires a bit more expertise to understand what the Haskell runtime is going to do in all those different situations. But when your emphasis is on the how, when your emphasis is on the what, Haskell starts to really shine. And I think that a lot of people who are writing smart contracts, their focus should also be more on the what. What is it that I want my contract to provide to my users? And the what and the how in the Pact language are moved very close together, so that you don't ever think about how the contract is executing as much as you do what is it actually trying to achieve. And Haskell just then is a natural fit to that way of thinking. So I believe there's no silver bullet, in my opinion. There's no perfect language. There's no one size fits all. So we do pay a slight cost in having to be a bit more expert at how the Haskell runtime system is executing these contracts on the actual machine, but it pays back in allowing us to move the problem to the correctness side of the equation rather than the operational side.
Super interesting. I think there's an overlap here too with some of the economics that allow this to happen. So if you think about a blockchain environment in which gas fees are high, it's expensive to run computation, each operation might be very, very precious. And so, for example, if you're writing some code and I don't know, maybe you have a cost that is supposed to increment every time someone calls a function. It might make sense for you to have your own logic for when you decide to check for an integer overflow, just to come up with a contrived example. Right. Because there's some expense with each of these operations that you're precious that you're paying for. Versus if you have a scalable foundation in which you can kind of conceive that gas fees will remain modest for perpetuity as things scale horizontally, then you can start to have a little more freedom in saying, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't bother the smart contract programmer with having to look up a potential overflow that might cause a contract that used to have a positive cost to then have a negative cost that then allows someone to drain the treasury. So, sort of a semi-technical point, but I think what's interesting too is this notion that allowing folks to operate at a little bit more abstracted level, not having to deal with quite as many nuts and bolts, does increase a little bit of the work that computers are doing, but at a huge increase in safety and convenience. And as long as you have a scalable model for keeping gas fees low and scaling transaction throughput, then these are some of the benefits that can be brought by that design decision.
Yeah, I agree. And especially that since I came from an environment, C++, where bit level familiarity with how the processor was executing your programs was essential, and then moving to functional programming, where you're trusting the compiler a little bit more, you're trusting the garbage collector, the runtime a little bit more, but you're gaining back that ability to think more abstractly.
Yeah, no, it's so cool. And, I see that at least during the periods of some of your stewardship at C++, of course, with C++ 14 and 17 and 20, having all these amazing functional programming concepts suddenly injected into the standard. It's a digression, I suppose. But anyway, I'll pick your brain on that another time. So we have a few more questions from chat that I think are quite interesting. Another one from KDA Miner. What are some of the things that you're most excited to be building that will improve the way current blockchains operate?
Oh, wow. That's a broad question. Right now, my biggest passion is to increase Pact understanding and adoption. I think that having people realize what a benefit Pact can be to the development of smart contracts is, I think, going to be key to where we go next. So I haven't yet been thinking about how this affects other blockchains, but I will be going in that direction a little bit more in the future.
Fantastic. Question from No Strings. What's your plan or roadmap on how Kadena can become the best blockchain in the future, knowing that there's plenty of blockchain projects out there claiming to be the best? So maybe in terms of following up on your point around Pact and Pact builders.
Yeah, I think Pact is the real distinguishing element. I mean, it's nice also that we have scalable proof of work. And so we have another story besides just proof of stake out in the world about how a blockchain can scale effectively to handle many, many, many transactions. But really, at the end of the day, this is going to be about correct contracts that can manage billions and billions of dollars without the risk of, as you said, an integer overflow, leading to people carrying away the tens and millions that they have and are continuing to do on other chains.
Yeah, so it becomes about that element of safety. There's something that I've found interesting in talking with different builders is a background that seems to be particularly well suited to doing blockchain and Pact programming is folks that have backend and database experience, that have, in some ways, Pact is a glorified query language that makes it
that's right.
Easy to read and write to tables, to a ledger. And I think that there's some intuition that folks that have experience working with databases have. And one of the areas that I've been kind of thinking about too is, how do you sort of introduce someone to programming, right? Because if you've taken someone and give them an introduction to how to program in Python or Java, and then you suddenly throw Pact in front of them, they're going to immediately realize that some of the tools in their kit that they turn to aren't available, and that they have to figure out a different way to do that. So I think that question of, well, how do you actually introduce people to a paradigm that has been very intentionally designed, a paradigm that has the tools in the shed are very intentional, because they're ones that allow you to do the scope of work that is needed, but in a manner that allows you to avoid all sorts of exploit or problems in code. But then that raises the interesting question of, well, one, what are the adjacent skills that people might have that best translate in? And then two, how do you sort of onboard people into a new paradigm of thinking, which is a challenge that the functional programming, and I imagine the Emacs community has had to deal with for a long time, as you've had people that are talented programmers that are sharp and smart, but suddenly have to figure out how to do something in a new way. So this is sort of a long-winded way of asking. I'd love to hear any lessons or musings that you might have around how you sort of introduce people into new programming paradigms, and then help accelerate them into becoming a productive participant.
Yeah, that is always the perennial problem, isn't it? And I recognize that Pact being written as a Lisp language makes it a little bit less familiar for a lot of people. Although there is a project underway right now that we call Kadena JS, which hopes to make our programming platform a little bit more familiar to users with JavaScript experience. But I think that in general, what people need is they need good examples. They need applications of interest to them that they can dive into and start working on, and be able to answer their questions very easily and readily. When I'm using a new language that I've never tried before, I will go to cookbooks. And usually for the language I'm using, there's a cookbook example to do the thing I want to do. Like, let's say I want to capitalize a string. Then that would be in a cookbook somewhere out there on the web. Getting more things like this up and around the Pact language, I think, will be essential to improving our adoption story.
Absolutely. So it's always easy to program when you have a piece of code you can look at that is adjacent to what you want to do and has the right skeleton, that you can then start with functional code and modify piece by piece. The classic, I'm going to just do the interpretive approach to building out my code base. Interesting question from Samuel Wilson. Can Pact be a good first language to learn for someone with no coding experience whatsoever?
If you want to be a developer in the Kadena ecosystem, absolutely. To translate from that to just general purpose, broad applicability in other places that you go, I still say yes, but it would have to be based on an understanding of what Pact is at its core. You see, if you research the functional programming literature, you'll come across something called the Lambda calculus. And the Lambda calculus is actually from math. In the 1930s, it was originally developed as a way to be a foundation for all math. It failed at that, but it succeeded at becoming a foundation for functional programming languages. And at the end of the day, as you said, Pact is a query language. It's a Lambda calculus that is able to interact with databases, with a local database, in this case, modifying the database in chain state. So if you learn Pact, you will be learning a Lambda calculus. And that skill translates. It translates easily to any other functional language, and it will translate also to other languages. But I would just encourage the person learning Pact as this being their first language to know that from the beginning and keep that in mind, because then it will open you up to all of the literature and other great things surrounding the Lambda calculus that have been researched and discovered over the last 90 years.
That's great. People often ask for alpha in these discussions, and this is the first time we've offered some Lambda, so mixing it up a little bit.
Right.
For those that haven't, if Lambda's calculus sounds scary, unfamiliar, there's some other fairly mainstream things that you might have heard of. For those that follow the startup space, you might have heard of Y Combinator, which is one of the top startup accelerators, which is also named after this really beautiful idea in the Lambda calculus. So these are ideas that you see over and over again that appear in wildly different domains. That's a bit of a unifying thread that allows one to think about, what is computation? What does it mean to, write in this language versus that language? And it offers really striking similarities between that of the mathematical world and that of programming. And there's also this beautiful intersection, I think, with formal verification, where being able to say that a computer program is in some ways a mathematical proof becomes sort of an interesting framing to look at these duality of structures. That, of course, you can think about something that's written as code that does these operations as being a computation, but you can also think about it as being this mathematical object that either a human can reason about or a machine can reason about, and then use to prove properties that increase safety and security with little extra cost or effort to the person that wrote it initially.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some appreciation for the community. Super stoked that you believe Pact is actually as important, if not more important, than the scalability of Kadena. I think that's a nice synopsis.
Yep, I fully agree with that statement.
And comment or question from Tim Makesner. This is a tricky one. How fast will Kadena reach mainstream adoption, or at least high crypto community adoption in your mind?
I do not know. I have never been good at timing the market, and this is another market I probably also don't have that skill in. I'm just going to keep my focus on Pact and the technology, try to grow its adoption as fast as possible, and then how it becomes adopted in the mainstream will just be an outcome of that work.
Fantastic. So I think we've hit on a few threads that I wanted to make sure that we got through around some of your past work experience, how you came into Kadena, and how some of your experiences will help you in your role as CTO. I'd love to hear a little bit, and we've touched on already, about what are some of the aspects that you're most excited about, perhaps over the next 3 or 6 months, in terms of settling into your role as CTO and your focus.
Well, I come to Kadena from a formal verification background, and it was Stuart wanting there to be more formal semantics behind Pact that really intrigued me about the project and brought me in. So I'm always going to be stressing quality, correctness, security, and safety as part of what we do. So over the next 6 months, I'm just excited to see how can I bring those factors more and more into the development process, but without impairing our ability to get good features out the door. It's always going to be a hand-in-hand type of process, but the nature and quality of the testing that we do, having that testing rely a little bit more on formal foundations and leveraging what Haskell provides us in those ways. Because one of the benefits of functional programming is that it's closer to mathematics. And when you're closer to mathematics, you can simply leverage a lot of ideas and concepts that have been worked out beautifully and proven to be correct over the last 50 to 100 years by the mathematical community. So I'm really excited to be able to see these two things come together more and more.
So I think whenever we talk about mathematics on a YouTube AMA, we probably have a fragmented effect on people listening. There's probably a subset of people that are like really stoked. They're like, "Oh my god, that's awesome! That some of this cool foundation stuff is going to make a better user experience." And then there's a fraction of people that maybe hear that and say, "Oh wow, calculus was a struggle, or I never got too far in higher math, and that sounds a little intimidating." So maybe if we could try to sort of connect some of this lower level foundation that we're talking about to more of the application layer. I think this question from Kadena UAE is perhaps perfectly suited for that. How long do you think it takes to learn Pact for a first time coder?
So that question is very dependent on what it is that you want to do with Pact. So some things are going to be a lot more challenging than others. If you wanted to write a simple, say, message board where you could just leave messages for your friends to come and see later, that would not take a whole lot of time. I would say that if you're a first-time coder, like really first time, it might be a few months to get really familiar with the Lisp language, with the Pact primitives, with the environment in which you interact with Chainweb to upload your contract. But it shouldn't be too much more than that. What I'm very interested to hear from people is, what are the stumbling blocks you run into when you're learning Pact for the first time? So if you find me on Discord or if you contact me through email, I'm always interested to hear user stories about what you found difficult or confusing, so that I can factor that feedback directly into how we improve our developer experience.
Wonderful. Question from Kobe, who's a builder on Kadena. In a market driven by such different trends like NFTs and DeFi, how do you keep your team focused on the most important infrastructure while keeping the developments relevant to the community?
That is a tougher question, but I do like to view NFTs and DeFi as stress tests of the platform and of the environment, because you have to debug those. You have to figure out what's going wrong with your DeFi contract, and then how the language supports your ability to debug, how the chain gives you insight into what your transactions are doing. Those are all questions that need to be answered for all problems, but NFTs and DeFi give a nice test bed for how do you answer those questions in that particular case. So I think that there's really not so much of a dichotomy between these two things. Like, the team being focused on Pact and the correctness of the language is part of the story of how NFTs and DeFi can sit well atop Kadena.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also creates this interesting question, and this is in some ways the bridge that is Kadena to Kadena Eco, of how do we take a key innovation at, say, the blockchain layer in terms of, for example, let's say that formal verification has a new property or a capability that it can guarantee or ensure about some code that's written. And that is a technical achievement in terms of increasing the scope of what's formally verified. And then the next question becomes, well, then how does one actually translate that sort of base level kind of programming language theory type of achievement into sort of a user story or a use case where someone that is developing NFT platform or DeFi can then leverage it.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of one of these key challenges always in terms of adoption of new technology, new concepts, because formal verification, while not new in an academic sense, is pretty darn new for people that are everyday nuts and bolts programmers. And so I think there becomes this question of, well, how do we provide the education? How do we provide the use cases? How do we connect some of that to the actual end users that have a problem they're trying to solve? That at a surface level, I want to have a collection with this many things, and they're going to be sellable by these people under these parameters, and transferable under these conditions, and at this such and such a date or with such and such restriction. Taking that and turning it into the foundational sort of mathematical problems that you're discussing, and how to make that approachable, I think is something that I definitely try to think through. And I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts as to how do we kind of take formal verification with all of its beauty and might and majesty and turn it into something as a user experience that isn't too intimidating, and we can kind of explain succinctly to a user and a builder.
Great question. Actually, there's a facility that is available to Pact programmers that was created before I started working at Kadena, but I definitely want to see it advance further forward. It's called FV, of course, for formal verification, but it is something that can run on Pact contracts where, given a very simplistic model of your function, let's say you're writing a function that takes an integer and returns an integer, and you want a property to hold that if the integer is positive, the result is positive. You can then express this property using an at model directive in specifying your function. And then FV will take those model directives as if they were assertions on a property you want the function to have. And it will scan the code of the function to make sure that whatever you've written there as the function's body upholds that property. And this is done automatically for you. So you're getting a lot of the benefits of what formal verification is all about without having to know how the proof of that property is being constructed. Simply the existence of the ability to construct it is enough to know that the property holds and is true without needing to you be the expert in how to make those proof terms.
Right. So I think that's something that's important to recognize, that sometimes when we say phrases or terms that may not be familiar and we say formal verification, it sounds intimidating, but at a surface level, examples of FV or formal verification can be very simple. It's a property that I put in something positive. Let's make sure that something positive comes out, right? Very easy idea. But then, the notion that it can actually be guaranteed that that's true is like kind of crazy for someone that is like thinking, well, if it comes from Python, it's like, well, you could write anything in there. How could the compiler know that it's true? And so, of course, to understand how that guarantee can be made requires some, formal study of the process. But that's where the complexity comes in. But for the end user that just knows this idea that I can write a function and declare a property that if a positive thing comes in, a positive thing comes out, and then the everything else is sort of magically done for me. You can kind of view it as the technology is magic layer of, I just need to know enough to use this as a tool. I don't need to necessarily know all the nuts and bolts behind the scenes. Let's see here. I see another interesting question here. It's kind of a tough one. Great Q&A from Tim Makesner. What are the biggest threats for Kadena right now, and what are you doing to fight against them?
Biggest threats. I mean, if there were threats I knew about that the community didn't, I wouldn't be able to say anything about them because that would just be attack surface. But I'm not aware right now of any really killer threats other than us maybe not moving fast enough to increase the adoption of Pact. Really, it just comes back to that. But I'm not aware of any exogenous factors that are a serious threat right now. I know there's a lot of scary things happening in the proof of stake world with the SEC and the proof of work world with things that the president has said in restricting miners' capability, but none of that has yet come down to affecting our project. So I would like to leave this question to a future date when some of these threats actually begin to materialize.
We have another question from Sebastian S. That I can chime in too as is helpful. What's the current status of multi-chain and Curo?
So multi-chain is definitely something we've been discussing a lot recently, because it would be nice for users to have an abstraction over all of the chains, where the multi-chain nature of Kadena is an implementation detail and not part of the essential abstraction of, of an indelible ledger, which is the way a lot of contract developers just want to see the system. So that is in discussion, and we're thinking about the APIs that would be needed to really provide that kind of abstraction to programmers. Curo is a project that is still alive. It's received a commit in June that I saw, but it's only kept alive. It would need a customer. It would need somebody coming forward and saying, hey, I really need to use Curo. And then Kadena would be very much happy to work with that user to get Curo working for their use case. But as long as there are no customers for it at the moment, then our attention is elsewhere. Makes
sense. Question from Kevin Lindquist. can you explain how Kadena is trying to get larger projects built on their blockchain? And I'm happy to answer this from the Kadena.
Yes, I was going to say
too.
this is a Kadena eco question.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a multifaceted approach. In some cases, we are pursuing talent directly, people in our own networks that we think are phenomenal programmers or have a good background, people that we meet at conferences that are excited and curious and have a demonstrated track record of building. Of course, our grants program in terms of inbound people from community that are already building, looking to get more resources and more support, helping existing projects become larger is a big focus. And then finally, I think it's about saying, how do you create content and material that then allows for people to organically start building? I remember I was doing a lot of travel back in 2013, and I had this problem where I wanted to be able to make phone calls to the US, and it was super expensive at the time. And I had, I don't remember if I saw a billboard or a Hacker News post or something. I'd seen some blog posts about Twilio, and in an afternoon was able to kind of spin up a little service that kind of bridged a local Twilio number with a remote Twilio number, and then I could do phone calls for a penny a minute instead of $2 a minute. And that was possible because there's all this great content, even though someone hadn't designed that specific little niche use case that I had. There is all this great content that made it, a simple aspect of finding the content that taught me how to do the pieces I need to know and then composing them together. And so I think that, in terms of organic growth, we are now just starting to see this really start to happen where every week or two, I'll get a message from Jaquin, who's monitoring some code commits in the blockchain quite frequently. And he'll be like, hey, I just saw this really interesting, 500, 600 line, module get deployed. It's good quality code. I have no idea who wrote it. Do you? And more often than not now, I'm looking at it and being like, I have no idea who wrote it either. So I think we've kind of hit some of this organic growth phase. And, if you think about what of really a vibrant ecosystem looks like, it's, it's not just projects that are receiving support from the ecosystem arm that are flourishing. It's people that are organically coming and building, solving their own needs, that then have the tools and the ability to learn that can go then build it. And if we can offer a little bit of extra support to help facilitate that, great. But, we don't get the credit. It's the builders and the content that allowed them to learn. So I think that in terms of getting larger projects built, we can, of course, try and get existing projects to come over. We can, of course, recruit existing teams to build. But I think the most exciting domain is helping new teams flourish and define new projects from scratch that are, really taking advantage of Kadena and its unique ecosystem and technology. I think we are coming up towards the end of our time here. I guess we'll take one last community question, then I have one last question for you, John, and then we'll wrap. So Matthew Hines, what problem in society do you see that Pact can solve that other blockchains can't?
Pact can solve that other blockchains can't.
Of course, with most things in computer science, like you could write something in C++, or you could write it in Rust, or you could write it in Python, or you can write it in MATLAB, and you can do the same thing. So maybe to reframe it, are there any applications or domains that you think that Pact is particularly well suited for, that other languages environments may not be as well suited for?
That's definitely an easier question to answer because there are a lot of other blockchains are simply more general than Pact. So you could ask the reverse question, what can they do that Pact can't? And there are several things they can do that Pact can't. But I think what Pact can't do makes it a better language for writing contracts that are all about financial security, about governance, things that depend upon the security of the chain. Pact natively handles multi-sig. It natively handles concepts like escrow, where some funds can be in mid-transit as a Pact executes over multiple blocks. These types of concepts are very easy and natural to Pact in a way that they aren't in other languages that are just because they're more general. And so then you have to build up libraries that express these ideas. Whereas in Pact, these ideas are very, very close to the structure of the language itself, which makes them more natural and first class.
One example I always like to give is, suppose, John, that you hired me as a consultant to work on something, and then time came for payment. There would be no way that you could screw up that contract such that I could recursively drain your bank account. It's just not It's not possible. And in fact, there's a reason why in most of our financial agreements that we don't have recursion. It's hard to reason about. And yet, we've seen these exploits over and over again. It's one of the most common exploits in Ethereum.
That's right.
Okay. So we have a final question. I think this is a great one actually to end on it. It beats my question I was going to ask you. So we'll take it from no strings. How do you see Kadena in 3 to 5 years?
In 3 to 5 years, I would just like to see many, many more Pact developers out in the world. I would like there to be a Pact-focused developer conference. I would like there to be communities for people to go to where they can rub shoulders with other Pact developers and get their questions answered easily. I mean, there is a Discord in which you can ask Pact questions, but I would like to see there being thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in that Discord that could answer those questions. I would like to see books on the scale of like an O'Reilly style book that would be a user guide for Pact, showing you Pact through example and building up that example over the course of the entire book. Yeah, just really a whole world of developers around Pact. And Pact executes on a blockchain, but in a lot of ways, that blockchain is just an execution framework for doing these database transactions. The concepts of Pact are not only about blockchain. They're about secure, passwordless, but yet strong authentication-based manipulation of databases. So just exploring that idea of what Pact offers as a secure database query language, going further with that idea would also be something I'd like to see in 3 to 5 years.
Very, very cool. So what's interesting there is, even though John is, of course, the chief technology officer, that this vision is very much around the folks building on Kadena, building with Pact. And so recognizing that a technology can be fantastic, but it's only as useful as its users make it. And so I think that this recognition is a critical one. And I'm just so delighted, John, that we have someone like you at the helm that's going to be able to drive some of this technical development and foundations that broaches some absolutely fascinating topics from an academic perspective, but while keeping this end vision of the ecosystem and the experience of builders and of being a Pact developer at heart. What a wonderful note to end on. And thank you so much for joining us on today's AMA.
Thank you, Tyler. One last note I would like to make is I have seen a lot of questions in the chat about when we'll be listed on Coinbase, details of our tokenomics, etc. I just want to say to those people that it's not that I'm ignoring your questions. It's just outside of my purview. Trading on Coinbase is certainly not something we don't want. It's just not in my immediate roadmap or the things that I can deliver as a technologist at Kadena. So I hear you, and I understand the interest and the concern for these topics, but this would not be the place where I could answer those questions.
Perfect. You can, of course, ask anything, and we'll answer the ones that are in the domain of what you work on. Right. All right, folks. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Those in the Kadena Army, the engagement's been absolutely phenomenal, and we are so happy by the response here to John joining. This has been a wonderful introduction for John to the community, and I hope for community to John. And we'll look forward to having you back on here sometime soon, and maybe even diving into some more technical topics. This has been absolutely fantastic.